It starts not with a discovery, but with silence. Somewhere beneath the dust of museum basements and the shadows of classified archives lies a version of history few are willing to confront, not because it lacks evidence, but because it doesn't fit. A stone inscribed in a forgotten language, a figurine buried too deep to belong, a wedge of metal found among mammoth bones. Each artifact whispers the same question: what if we've only scratched the surface of our past? Throughout the 20th century, archaeologists across the globe unearthed objects that defied the narratives carved into textbooks. Not hoaxes, not folklore, but physical things, tangible, dated, and documented, that suggested the world was once stranger, older, more interconnected than we dare to imagine. And then, almost without exception, those artifacts vanished. Some were seized, quietly relocated by institutions meant to preserve knowledge. Others were ridiculed into obscurity. Careers ended. Funding dried up. Publications were rejected without explanation. The pattern repeated with disturbing regularity. Find something that doesn't fit, and you find yourself erased alongside it. Frank Hibben thought he'd discovered a key to pre-Columbian contact, a massive boulder near Los Lunas, New Mexico, etched with what appeared to be ancient Hebrew. He documented it carefully. Then came the visit from the Smithsonian, a conversation behind closed doors. After that, doors closed for him everywhere. In Mexico, archaeologist José García Payón uncovered a Roman-style head sealed beneath 3 undisturbed layers of pre-Columbian flooring. He recorded every detail, every layer of soil. And then the museum took it, not to exhibit, only to store. When researchers asked to test it years later, they were told no. It wasn't the science that was questioned, it was the implications. There is no single institution orchestrating this silence, no secret cabal. What there is, however, is a shared resistance to rewriting what has already been written. The idea that ancient humans were isolated, simple, or limited in scope has become more than just a theory. It's a foundation. And when something threatens that foundation, it's quietly removed from sight. Why? Because if a Roman head is buried in ancient Mexico, if dinosaur figurines are thousands of years old, if batteries existed in Baghdad 2 millennia before Volta, then we must accept that history is not a clean line, but a tapestry with threads lost and tangled. We must accept that the ancients were not less than us, but perhaps in some ways more. This series does not claim to have the final answers. It does not seek to accuse or provoke. It simply asks, what if we looked again? Over the next 13 chapters, we'll explore 12 discoveries that surfaced, only to disappear. Each begins with a moment of awe, followed by resistance, and ends with a question that still lingers, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to wonder, and perhaps to rediscover. Because the past does not vanish on its own. It is buried, piece by piece, artifact by artifact, and it is time to start digging again. It began with wind, dust, and a solitary hillside in New Mexico. In 1933, Frank Hibben, a professor from the University of New Mexico, stood before a boulder that seemed out of place, massive, worn, and inscribed with symbols no one could easily explain. The stone, nestled near Los Lunas, bore what appeared to be the 10 Commandments, etched in ancient Paleo-Hebrew. Not a replica, not a hoax. A language predating Columbus by over 1,000 years, carved into rock half a world from where such words should be found. If it was authentic, this stone didn't just belong to history. It rewrote it. Hibben, no stranger to controversy but committed to his craft, documented everything: photographs, measurements, geological context. He anticipated skepticism, but not silence, not suppression. His colleagues didn't engage, they warned. And soon the Smithsonian arrived, not with accolades, but with quiet instructions. Say nothing. From that moment, Hibben's career began to fray. Funding dried up. Journals declined his papers without comment. Colleagues who once welcomed his insight now distanced themselves. He hadn't just found a stone, he had touched a nerve. The Los Lunas stone remained on that remote hillside, immovable and unclaimed. But access to it changed. The landowner, once indifferent, began receiving pressure. Visitors were discouraged. Other researchers who dared to investigate found their reputations, too, quietly disassembled. And yet the evidence spoke, if only to those willing to listen. Linguists who reviewed Hibben's records confirmed the writing matched Paleo-Hebrew of roughly 500 BCE. The carving technique bore signs of natural weathering. The patterns in the stone's erosion told a story of age, not forgery. Still, the stone never entered mainstream debate. It was too much, too early, too disruptive. Instead, it became a curiosity, officially labeled of unknown origin, a historical orphan. Hibben never let go of his conviction. Until his death, he insisted the Los Lunas inscription was genuine. He believed ancient Semitic travelers may have crossed oceans long before the names of continents had settled. He believed the truth mattered, even if it meant exile from his profession. But the photographs he took, the notes he made, the precise linguistic comparisons, most of that material has vanished from university archives. The trail he left is faint now, scattered across footnotes, lost interviews, and a weathered slab of stone that still rests under open sky. We don't know who carved it. We don't know what ship carried them or why they etched those words into stone. We only know it doesn't belong. And that, perhaps, is why it remains unclaimed. What do we fear in rewriting our past? Is it that we'll lose certainty? Or that we'll find ourselves smaller in the face of an ancient, interconnected world? The Los Lunas stone asks us to step beyond borders, not just of geography, but of thought. It whispers across centuries, not in declarations, but in questions. Who came before, and why have we forgotten them? It started with the glint of clay beneath a horse's hoof. In 1944, Waldemar Julsrud, a German merchant living in Acambro, Mexico, wasn't looking for history. He was riding along the base of El Toro Hill when he spotted ceramic fragments protruding from the earth. Curious, he began to dig. What he unearthed would ignite decades of debate and denial. Figurines, thousands of them, human shapes, animals, everyday life scenes. But then something else. Creatures with scales and tails, long necks and claws. Dinosaurs. Not mythical ones, but shockingly detailed representations that matched species catalogued by modern paleontology. Brachiosaurus, Triceratops, pterosaurs. And often these ancient beasts were shown interacting with humans, being hunted, ridden, even revered. Over time, Julsrud recovered more than 30,000 of these figurines from the site. No forger stepped forward. No workshop was found. And who could have sculpted creatures science had only recently begun to describe? Scientists arrived, intrigued. Then came the verdict: hoax. But the explanation lacked conviction. Thermoluminescence dating, conducted in 1968, placed some of the pieces at over 4,500 years old. The mineral patina matched ancient burial conditions. The quantity alone, tens of thousands, made coordinated forgery implausible. Yet still the consensus remained: fake. Why? Because if they were real, everything changed. Charles Hapgood, a respected professor and geologist, once praised by Einstein himself, took a serious interest. He studied the collection, cross-checked the dating, and concluded they were authentic representations of a culture with unknown knowledge. His findings, however, went unpublished by academic journals. His credibility suffered. The Mexican government confiscated parts of the collection for analysis. Those pieces were never seen again. Museums that had expressed interest quietly backed away. And slowly, The figurines were dismissed, not by testing, but by omission. A few pieces remain in private hands. Independent labs that tested them confirmed their age, again and again. But without institutional endorsement, the results sit unacknowledged, too inconvenient, too disruptive. And so the Acambro figures exist in limbo, an archaeological collection that no one will officially investigate and few dare to defend. What if they are real? What if memory stretches deeper than we allow? Not of humans walking with dinosaurs, perhaps, but of myths passed down for millennia, carved into clay with such reverence that they outlasted even the bones beneath them. Or perhaps it is something else, something we haven't yet imagined. The question is not whether the Acambro figurines are genuine. The question is, what kind of world would we have to accept if they were, and are we brave enough to face it? It was small, unassuming, a head no larger than a child's fist. In 1933, deep in the Tecaxic Valley of Mexico, archaeologist José García Payón was excavating a pre-Columbian burial site. His team had uncovered 3 intact flooring levels of an ancient structure, untouched for centuries. Beneath the lowest floor, sealed within an offering deposit, they found it. A terracotta head with curled hair, a beard, and distinctly European features. It didn't look Mesoamerican. It looked Roman. Payón knew immediately what he was holding. The find was meticulously documented, photographed in situ, stratigraphy carefully recorded. The context left no doubt. This artifact had been placed there before the arrival of the Spanish, long before any accepted contact with Europe. A Roman artifact buried in ancient Mexico. Word spread quickly. Excitement turned to skepticism. Then came the silence. The head was quietly transferred to the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. But rather than being displayed, it was placed in storage. Requests to study it were delayed or denied. Payón was discouraged from publishing further analysis. The official story shifted. Perhaps it was a colonial-era fake, somehow mixed with the ancient offerings. But the evidence didn't align with that explanation. The sealed context couldn't be faked. There were no signs of disturbance. And Payón was no amateur. He was respected, precise, cautious. Decades passed. In the 1990s, with better dating methods available, independent researchers were finally allowed to examine the artifact. Thermoluminescence testing dated it to around 800 years ago. The clay matched Roman-era compositions. The artistic style was consistent with second-century Roman craftsmanship. The science confirmed what Payón had claimed from the beginning. And yet, the response remained muted. No museum exhibit, no revision of history books. Just a quiet shelving of the report, a return to the narrative already taught. Why? Because acknowledging this one small head would demand a radical reevaluation. That perhaps Roman traders, adventurers, or castaways had crossed oceans long before Columbus. That the ancient world was more connected than we believed. That the line between Old World and New World was always more porous than we've admitted. But admitting that would unravel more than history. It would unsettle the foundation of what we think we know. Today, the terracotta head remains in museum storage, carefully preserved, rarely shown. Officially a curiosity, unofficially a threat. And Payón? He died before he could see the truth of his discovery acknowledged. His careful notes survive only in fragments. His legacy, like the head he uncovered, exists just beyond the reach of acceptance. We often assume that history is written by the victors, but more often it's edited by the comfortable. What truths lie waiting, not in secrecy, but in the drawers of institutions too fearful to turn the page? And what kind of past are we trying to protect by refusing to read it? It came down from the sky, or so the story goes. May 1950, Kingman, Arizona. A crash in the desert. Not of a plane, nor a meteorite, but something else, metallic, silent, and swift. Whatever it was, the military responded within hours, securing the area, moving with quiet urgency. And among the summoned was an engineer, a man trained not in myth, but in material science. His account, shared years later under a pseudonym, spoke of wreckage unlike anything he'd ever seen. Metal that was feather-light, yet unyielding, panels that seemed grown rather than built, symbols etched into surfaces, unfamiliar and untranslatable. Buttons, ports, and panels, tools perhaps, but not made for human hands. He wasn't alone. Civilians, scientists, specialists. All brought in. All sworn to secrecy. The fragments were catalogued, boxed, and vanished into the vast network of military storage and silence. Wright-Patterson, some whispered. Private contractors, others claimed. What remained above ground were only stories, eyewitnesses whose credibility was easier to question than their consistency. Then in 1973, Raymond Fowler, a researcher, found the engineer. What he recorded was not wild speculation, but calm, technical recollection. Every detail matched known properties of aerospace materials, except they exceeded known capabilities. Other witnesses began to surface. A radar operator who'd tracked something strange, a military police officer who'd guarded the perimeter, a driver who hauled sealed crates to destinations he was never told. Still, no government confirmation came. Freedom of Information Act requests were denied on grounds of national security. To this day, documentation from 1953 remains classified, but the stories persist. And not just stories, patterns. Reports of technologies ahead of their time described decades before their invention. Wreckage that defied metallurgy. Programs that recruited talent from the edges of engineering and never explained what they were building. It's not the crash itself that is most haunting. It's what came after, the vanishing, the silence, the way those who saw too much were folded into anonymity. Perhaps it was advanced human tech, a secret project lost to time. Perhaps it was something else, something not ours. But speculation isn't the point. The point is that something fell, something was found, and something was hidden. Not for lack of evidence, but because that evidence challenged what we say is possible. 70 years later, the Kingman artifacts remain unseen. Somewhere, perhaps, they are still being studied. Or maybe they've been buried for good. But those who saw them still remember. Not the shapes, not the symbols, but the feeling that what they witnessed didn't just come from elsewhere. It came from the future. And the question still hovers, silent as that desert night. If we have held the future in our hands, why have we let it disappear? It began with the roots of a tree. In 1898, near Kensington, Minnesota, a farmer named Olaf Ullman and his son were clearing land when they stumbled upon a stone tangled beneath an old tree's roots. Heavy and rectangular, the slab bore a strange inscription, lines of runes carved into its face, worn but legible. The words, when translated, told of a band of Norse explorers from 1362. They described a journey deep into the North American interior, the death of companions, and the carving of the stone as a memorial. If true, it meant Vikings had reached Minnesota more than a century before Columbus set sail. But the response was swift and unforgiving. Within weeks, scholars declared it a hoax. The runes, they claimed, didn't match medieval Scandinavian usage. The dialect seemed inconsistent. It had to be a forgery. Ullman was bewildered. He was no academic, no artisan of forgeries. A farmer with little formal education, he had no reason to fake medieval runes, nor the skill to carve them with such precision. But once the verdict of fraud was pronounced, it stuck. Still, questions lingered. The stone bore signs of weathering deep within the carved grooves, suggesting centuries of exposure. Experts who examined the artifact firsthand often hesitated to condemn it as a fake, while those who never saw it were quick to dismiss it. In 1948, the Smithsonian took custody of the Runestone, but access became restricted. Requests for advanced testing were routinely denied. The institution's position remained fixed. The stone was a 19th century hoax, yet no comprehensive study supporting that conclusion was ever published. Then, in the year 2000, geologist Scott Wolter was finally granted permission to conduct detailed analysis. His study revealed mineral deposits and weathering patterns that strongly supported the stone's age. His conclusion? The inscription was likely genuine and had been carved centuries ago. Mainstream academia shrugged. The findings were largely ignored. Today, the Kensington Runestone sits in a small Minnesota museum returned from its institutional exile. It draws curious visitors, skeptics, and believers. But its status remains unchanged in textbooks, a dismissed anomaly. And yet it lingers. Because if Norse explorers reached Minnesota in the 14th century, then the story of America's discovery becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tale not of firsts, but of layers, of forgotten crossings and erased memories. What if the Runestone is not a forgery, but a footprint? What if our resistance to that possibility has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with ownership? In the roots of an old tree, something ancient was waiting to be remembered, and we, centuries later, still don't know whether to listen or to look away. The mountains held their breath. In 1938, deep within the Bayankara Ula Range on the border of China and Tibet, an expedition led by archaeologist Chi Pu-te entered a series of remote caves. Inside, they found something unexpected, not treasure, not bones of known animals, but hundreds of perfectly round stone discs, each about a foot wide, with spiral grooves etched from center to edge. Closer examination revealed something astonishing. The grooves contained microscopic hieroglyphs, symbols so small they required magnification to study. Alongside the discs were skeletons, small, frail, with disproportionately large skulls, and cave paintings of celestial bodies and helmeted figures. The local legends whispered of the Dropa, beings who had come from the stars and could not return. Chi Pu-te's team brought 716 discs back to Beijing. For years they sat in obscurity. No one knew how to decipher the symbols. No one wanted to believe the implications. Then in 1962, Professor Tsum Nui published a paper. He claimed to have translated the script. According to his work, the discs told the story of the Dropa people, spacefarers who crash-landed on Earth 12,000 years ago. Stranded in the mountains, they made peace with local tribes, lived, died, and were buried in these caves. The reaction was swift and brutal. Tsum's paper was labeled a fraud. He was barred from publishing further research. Soon after, he vanished from academic records, and the discs themselves were scattered. Some reportedly destroyed during China's Cultural Revolution, others sent to Soviet labs. A few surfaced in private collections, still bearing the delicate spirals and silent grooves. What little analysis has been allowed found oddities. Unusual concentrations of cobalt, strange magnetic properties, grooves too uniform to be carved by hand. But without the full set, without official support, no conclusion could be reached. Chinese authorities now deny the entire episode. The caves remain undiscovered, the skeletons unmentioned, the discs forgotten. But memory persists in whispers. A few discs survive, passed between collectors and researchers. Their inscriptions remain unreadable, but tantalizing. Their presence undeniable, like voices locked in stone, waiting for a listener who won't be silenced. What if it wasn't just a myth? What if a civilization, our own or another, left behind a message too large for our history and too small for our pride? The Dropa stones remain one of the most elusive discoveries of the 20th century. Not because they were hidden, but because we chose not to see them. Sometimes the hardest truths to accept are the ones we never allow ourselves to translate. And somewhere in a mountain cave, perhaps, the stars are still waiting to speak. It rose from the earth, deep beneath layers untouched by time. In 1889, in the quiet town of Nampa, Idaho, workers drilling a well struck something unexpected. At a depth of over 300 feet, buried beneath volcanic basalt and geological layers dated to nearly 2 million years ago, they pulled up a small clay figurine. It was human-shaped, delicately formed, clearly crafted, and it shouldn't have existed. The implications were staggering. If the geological context was correct, then something with human hands, or human intelligence, had shaped art in North America long before Homo sapiens were supposed to exist. Scientists examined the site. They confirmed the depth. The basalt layers above the figurine were undisturbed. There was no evidence of intrusion, no signs of modern contamination. George Frederick Wright, a respected geologist and theologian, led the investigation. He interviewed the workers, studied the drill samples, and published his findings with caution and clarity. The backlash came quickly. Other scientists, many of whom had not seen the artifact or the site, declared it impossible, therefore fraudulent. Journals that had reported the discovery retracted coverage. The Smithsonian, which had briefly expressed interest, withdrew. No evidence of fraud was ever produced. But the theory that early humans, or something like them, had existed in the Americas millions of years ago was simply too disruptive, too dangerous. Wright stood by his work, but his career suffered. His credibility waned. And the figurine, once the subject of national intrigue, faded into obscurity. Today it resides in the Idaho State Historical Society, not in a display case, but in storage, classified as a curiosity. A footnote. Requests for modern analysis, thermoluminescence testing, compositional studies, geological cross-checks have been denied or ignored. The technology to verify its origin exists, but the will does not. Because if the Nampa figurine is genuine, it means rewriting not just American prehistory, but the story of human evolution. It suggests intelligence, perhaps civilization, far older than we've ever allowed ourselves to imagine. What if the story of humanity is not a straight line, but a spiral? Rising, falling, forgetting? What if we are not the first, but only the latest? The clay figure from Nampa stares up from its forgotten box with eyes carved by a hand that time has erased, and the silence surrounding it may be the deepest layer of all. It was found among bones, ancient ones. In 1974, near the Mureș River in Romania, construction workers uncovered a set of remains buried beneath 35 feet of sediment. Two were unmistakable, mastodon bones, remnants of a species extinct for at least 10,000 years. But the third object was something entirely different, a wedge-shaped piece of metal. Roughly 8 inches long, with clean angles and machined surfaces, the artifact was unlike anything expected in such ancient strata. When scientists analyzed its composition, they were stunned. It was made primarily of aluminum, a metal not produced by humans until the 19th century due to the complexity of its extraction. But here it was, buried alongside Ice Age fossils. Romanian researchers confirmed its metallurgy. The wedge contained traces of copper and zinc, suggesting intentional alloying. It bore signs of oxidation and patina consistent with extreme age. Its surfaces appeared machined, not shaped by hand. For a brief moment, the artifact, dubbed the Aiud wedge, promised to reshape our understanding of technological history, and then, just as swiftly, it vanished from view. Official explanations emerged, attempting to frame the object as modern debris, perhaps a fragment of construction equipment that had somehow slipped into the depths. but the sediment was undisturbed. No intrusion shaft, no signs of recent burial. The scientific papers quietly stopped. Access to the artifact was restricted. Foreign researchers met with silence or contradictions. The Aiud wedge disappeared into storage. Its early supporters stopped speaking publicly, and the possibilities it suggested faded into silence. Some speculated the object was a fragment of an aircraft, perhaps even of wartime origin, but no model matched its shape, nor explained its depth. Others proposed more radical theories, evidence of lost civilizations, or even off-world contact. But without transparent study, speculation became the only currency. What remains is an anomaly, a manufactured metal object buried in an ancient riverbed, accompanied by fossilized bones. A wedge against time. Its very existence forces a question that institutions have not been willing to answer. What happens when we find something that should not be? Do we examine it with curiosity, or bury it again beneath paperwork and forgetfulness? The Aiud wedge reminds us that the ground beneath our feet holds not just bones, but riddles. And sometimes we walk over the answers we are not yet ready to face. It began with guano and ended in legend. In 1911, miners working in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, weren't seeking history. They were harvesting bat droppings for fertilizer. But as they dug deeper, beneath the layers of dust and waste, they unearthed something far more intriguing: bones. And not just any bones. These were human remains, but unusually large. Some of the skeletons measured over 7 feet tall, with massive skulls and strong jawlines. Red hair, preserved by the dry desert conditions, clung stubbornly to some of the skulls. Alongside the bones were sandals longer than most modern feet, and tools sized for people of formidable stature. And then there were the artifacts, beautifully woven duck decoys, baskets, weapons, and fishing gear, crafted with remarkable skill. Whoever had lived here had not just survived, they had thrived. Local Paiute tribes had a story for that. According to their oral tradition, there had once been a race of red-haired giants, the Tecaxic, who were fierce, cannibalistic, and eventually destroyed by a coalition of tribes. The final battle, they said, had taken place in a cave. The giants were trapped, the entrance set ablaze. The cave, they said, was Lovelock. As news of the discovery spread, academic institutions took note. The Smithsonian reportedly arrived to collect the most significant remains and artifacts. But after that, access grew more limited. Some bones were lost, others quietly placed in storage. When researchers sought to examine the oversized skeletons, they were told the specimens were misidentified or unavailable. Decades later, archaeologists acknowledged the craftsmanship of the duck decoys, some of the oldest and finest ever found in North America. Yet they downplayed or ignored the context in which they were discovered. The bones? Dismissed. The legends? Treated as myth. But the oral history had existed long before the miners disturbed the cave. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, a Paiute author and activist, had written about the Tecaxic in 1883, nearly 30 years before the cave was excavated. Her account matched the discoveries with eerie precision. Today, Lovelock Cave is closed to further excavation. The artifacts are scattered across museums. The bones are gone. The official narrative maintains that no race of giants ever existed in North America. And yet, the cave still whispers. Its layers tell a story that science will not, and legend refuses to forget. What do we lose when we ignore the stories of those who came before us, indigenous voices, mythic memory, inconvenient truths? Perhaps not all giants are creatures of fantasy. Some lie buried beneath the weight of disbelief, waiting to be seen again, not as legends, but as people history chose not to remember. It sat quietly in a museum case, mistaken for something ordinary. In 1938, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig was examining artifacts at the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad when he noticed something peculiar: small clay jars, each about 6 inches tall, with copper cylinders inside. Suspended within those cylinders were iron rods. The arrangement was unmistakable. Koenig wasn't just looking at ancient pottery. He was looking at a battery. The objects dated to around 200 BCE, centuries before the birth of modern electrochemistry. Koenig proposed a bold theory. These vessels were galvanic cells capable of producing electrical current. He suggested they may have been used for electroplating, gilding silver with gold, something ancient artisans were known to achieve, though no one quite understood how. It wasn't speculation. When replicas were made and filled with vinegar or citrus juice, they produced electricity. The Baghdad battery, as it came to be known, could have changed the way we understood ancient technology. It offered a glimpse into lost knowledge, practical science developed thousands of years before it re-emerged in the West. But the response wasn't curiosity. It was dismissal. Mainstream scholars labeled the theory fringe. Alternative explanations were proposed. Perhaps the jars were used for storing scrolls or religious relics. None of these fully accounted for the presence of copper, iron, and bitumen, a perfect combination for insulation and conduction. Still, Koenig's idea was quietly sidelined. Not refuted, not disproven, just ignored. Then came the chaos of war. In the early 2000s, during the looting of Baghdad's museums, the original batteries were lost, stolen, or destroyed. No complete inventory exists. The objects that could have proven or disproven Koenig's theory with modern analysis disappeared into history once more. Other similar artifacts have since surfaced in different collections. But attempts to study them, to look for chemical residues, signs of electrical use, have been met with silence or refusal. The official narrative holds they were ritual objects, nothing more. But if that were true, why does the design work so well? What if the Baghdad battery wasn't a fluke, but a fragment, a piece of a larger forgotten practice, one that knew how to harness power in ways we're only now beginning to rediscover? And if the ancients knew how to create electricity, what else did they understand? Sometimes the past speaks not in grand monuments, but in small, misunderstood objects. A jar, a rod, a forgotten charge. And sometimes history isn't rewritten because we lack evidence. It's rewritten because the evidence no longer fits the story we choose to tell. It began with a photograph and ended in silence. In 1933, a black and white image emerged from the archives of the University of New Mexico. It showed a massive stone standing on a hillside near Los Lunas, inscribed with an ancient script, what appeared to be the 10 Commandments, carved not in English, Latin, or Spanish, but in early Hebrew. The man who found it, Frank Hibben, believed he had stumbled upon something world-changing. But his story was not unique. Across decades and continents, archaeologists uncovered objects that didn't belong. The Acambro figurines, the Roman head in Mexico, the Nampa figurine from deep beneath the Idaho earth. Each time, the finders documented their discoveries, submitted them to experts, and expected debate. Instead, they met denial, not scientific rejection, but bureaucratic vanishing. Funding was cut, papers were refused, museum doors were locked. And in each case, the artifact itself, the undeniable physical proof, was sequestered, stored, mislabeled, or lost. Why? Because these discoveries didn't fit the narrative. They posed questions without acceptable answers. They blurred the neat timelines that modern history is built upon. The Kensington Runestone told of Norse explorers in 14th century Minnesota. The Dropa stones described an ancient crash from the stars. The Baghdad battery hinted at lost electrochemical knowledge. Each one was a wedge in the timeline, or a fracture in the myth of modern progress. The institutions that controlled history, museums, governments, universities, chose not to study these anomalies. They chose to ignore them, or worse, to erase them. And those who refused to let go, scientists, geologists, linguists, paid the price. Reputations were dismantled. Research was silenced. The message was clear: challenge the established story, and you risk exile. It wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, and more effective. An architecture of denial. Artifacts that defied explanation weren't burned or smashed. They were cataloged, filed away, locked behind policies of insufficient context or questionable provenance. Once hidden, they became invisible. Once discredited, they became untouchable. And yet they remain. In dusty drawers, in forgotten storage rooms, in private collections kept out of public view. They wait, not just for rediscovery, but for reacceptance. The truth is, the past is not fixed. It is alive, messy, unfinished. And history, real history, is not a closed book. It's a question. What if we got it wrong? What if our ancestors were more connected, more curious, more capable than we ever imagined? The evidence is there. It always has been. Waiting for us to finally look at it without fear. Waiting for us to ask, what else have we buried? It flickered on the edge of science and story, a signal lost in static. The most enduring discoveries are not always made in the dirt. Some are made in the mind. Glimpses, intuitions, connections between what we know and what we sense is missing. But for the archaeologists who uncovered forbidden artifacts, their discoveries were anything but abstract. They were real, tangible, weighty in hand and implication. And for that they paid. Frank Hibben, whose Los Lunas stone suggested Semitic explorers reached the Americas long before Columbus, found his academic career quietly unraveled. His work questioned too much. José García Payón, who documented a Roman head buried beneath undisturbed pre-Columbian layers, watched his find disappear into museum storage, locked away from the public. Waldemar Hulsrud collected over 30,000 figurines in Acambro, some depicting dinosaurs known only from modern science. His site was dismissed, but never disproven. The artifacts? Seized, hidden, scattered. George Frederick Wright, Tsum Nui, Chi Pu Te. Each of them offered the world a piece of a larger puzzle, and each was met not with curiosity, but resistance. Their stories aren't about conspiracy in the cloak and dagger sense. They're about fear. Institutional fear. The fear of upending consensus. The fear that if one artifact proves true, then 100 assumptions may fall like dominoes. That centuries of certainty could dissolve. But the silence that followed their discoveries was loud. Universities that once championed innovation fell quiet. Museums that claimed to preserve knowledge became gatekeepers of what was acceptable to know. And the public, unaware of what had been found, was never given the chance to wonder. What unites these cases is not just the strangeness of the artifacts, it's the way they were handled, not with rigorous debate, but with avoidance, not with study, but with suppression. And in the shadows of that suppression, truth remains a prisoner, because evidence doesn't vanish by accident. It is misplaced with purpose, labeled inconclusive, rendered invisible, but not erased. The artifacts remain. So do the photographs, the measurements, the faded field notes. They still whisper their stories to those willing to listen, and they still ask the question that has never quite been silenced. What if the past was different than we were told? Not better, not worse, just more. More ancient, more connected, more advanced in ways we've forgotten. In every sealed drawer and unmarked box, there is still the possibility of rediscovery, of rewriting, not to disrupt, but to understand. Because history is not only what survives, it's also what we choose to see, and what we finally allow ourselves to believe. The past does not speak in shouts. It murmurs in stone and clay, in bone and metal, in forgotten stories left to gather dust. Across deserts and mountains, beneath volcanic rock and museum floors, fragments of a different history lie hidden. Not because they were lost, but because we chose to look away. This journey has taken us through 14 stories, 12 discoveries, one pattern, and a final question. From the high caves of China to the red soil of New Mexico, from Roman heads in Mexico to batteries buried in Baghdad, a common thread binds them all: the refusal to fit. Each artifact challenged the official script. Each discovery offered a new possibility of ancient contact, forgotten technology, lost memory. And each was met with quiet resistance, not because the evidence was weak, but because it threatened the comfort of certainty. We live in a world built on stories. Some are carved in stone, others in policy, and the most powerful of them all are the ones we never question. But truth doesn't vanish. It lingers in the cracks of accepted narratives, in the corners of museums, in the pages of rejected journals. It waits for those willing to ask again, to see again. Because history is not a straight path. It is layered, tangled, alive. And we, as a species, are not its final chapter. We are its storytellers. In choosing which truths to share, we shape the legacy we leave behind. So we end not with a conclusion, but with a beginning, a call to curiosity, to revisit what has been buried, not to unearth conspiracies, but to recover wonder, to honor the archaeologists who dared to follow the evidence even when it led to silence, and to ask again and again, what else lies waiting in the dark? What truths have we buried, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? And what kind of world might we build if we were brave enough to remember?